Welcome all of you in ethical hacking ME class. We are in lecture 1 of unit 3. In unit 3 we shall discuss types of web server architecture, that may be either IIS or it may be Apache Web Server. We shall discuss some web server attacks. We shall discuss methodology of web server attacks that may due to misconfiguration of web server, HTTP response splitting and webcast poisoning, hijacking HTTP response, SSH brute force attacks. Today I will cover this. Tomorrow I shall cover web server attack methodology that includes gathering information, footprinting and mirroring website, web server attacks tools, and their countermeasures. And we also discuss in third lecture of unit 3 wireless network hacking. Then we discuss overview of wireless network, wireless encryption techniques, threat associated in the wireless networks, and types of wireless network, that is extension to wired, multiple access point, LAN to LAN, is 3G or 4G hotspot. In the last lectures of Unit 3, we shall discuss wireless standard process of authentication in wireless network, wireless hacking methodology, wireless security tool, and countermeasures. So, this is the outline of today's lectures. In today's lectures, we are going to discuss types of web server architecture, IIS and Apache, web server attacks. We also discuss some methodology of web server attacks, that may be misconfiguration of web server. We shall discuss HTTP response splitting, and we also discuss webcast poisoning. We see the real examples using burp suite. Then we discuss hijacking HTTP response, and finally we discuss SSH brute force attack. So, first, we should know what is web server. When our client, that may be my operating system, that may be our personal digital assistant, that may be our mobile, that may be laptop, that may be our PC. When connect with internet, we try to open some website, and from where that website data came into our browser. So from web server, our client receives the response in form of HTML or CSS. So the HTML and CSS, ASP, JSP, PHP are front end, and there is also a database behind the back as a back end for any web application or for any website. So here a spelling mistake, it is a web server, not vServer. There are so many types of web server. Most of the internet is based on web server software. Basically, a web server retrieves content from local storage and delivers it to the client. There are so many web server, but these 5 are the most popular ones. Apache Web Server, IIS, Nginx, Apache Tomcat, Lite, HTTPD. Our syllabus cover only Apache Web Server and IIS, but we know some basics about these three. That will not from exam point of view, but just to enrich our knowledge. Apache Web Server. Apache is currently the most used web server in the world. It was founded in 1996. It is now maintained by the Apache Foundation. It is a freeware and compatible with Linux, Windows, FreeBSD, Mac, and several other platforms. IIS, also one of the most popular web server examples. IIS belongs to Microsoft. IIS stands for Microsoft Internet Information Services. It comes with the Windows Server operating system, and it is configurable through a graphical interface. Then Nginx. It is one of the most popular web server software. Nginx was developed by Igor Sisue in 2002. Also, it is not a standalone web server example. Nginx is a different example because it works as a proxy server together with another web server application like Apache. It was developed to handle hundreds of concurrent connections, delivering better performance. Meant to be a load balanced web server for heavy applications. Also, it claims to be responsible for 66% of the busiest sites. Then there is Apache Tomcat. Tomcat is a free web server specialized in Java servlets. In other words, it has a Java container. Apache Tomcat was initially developed by Sun Microsystem, then it was transferred by Apache to the Apache Software Foundation in 1999. By the way, Tomcat usually works under the port 8080 and support PHP, ASP.NET, Perl, Python, JSP, etc. Light HTTP was initially developed in 2003. Basically, it is not a very common web server software example for public websites on the internet. It has a big advantage, as the name says, it is a lighter HTTP server available. It uses a very low memory, CPU, and disk space. Internet routers, web cameras, and other small hardware use light HTTPD as their web server. Types of web server. There are many web server available. Basically, IIS is one of the few paid software. Web server price may vary. Apache is the most used web server. Large websites with too much traffic generally use Nginx. Apache Tomcat had more market in the past as Java containers are not very used nowadays. As Light HTTPD is a great software to be used as a local web server or for a small web hosting projects. Then in exam, because IAS and Apache is your part of syllabus, so in an exam there may be a questions difference between IIS and Apache or make a comparative study of IIS and Apache. So when they ask difference between II and Apache, then your answer may be Apache is free while IIS is backed with Windows. IIS only runs on Windows while Apache can run on almost any OS including Unix, Apple's OS X and on most Linux distributions. ESPX runs only in IIS. IIS has a dedicated staff to answer most problems, while support for Apache comes from community itself. IIS is optimized for Windows because they are from the same company, and the Windows operating system is prone to security risks, but Apache has less security risks. Then, now we discuss web server attacks. So on a web server, there are so many possibility of attacks. One may be HTML injection, one may be session hijacking, other may be cross-site scripting, other may be URL interpretation. Also, there may be some SQL injection, and there are so many web server vulnerabilities. So we'll discuss all attack one by one. The first common attack is DOS or DDoS attack. DOS or DDoS attacks involves flooding target with numerous fake requests so that the target stops functioning and can be unavailable to the legitimate users. Using a web server DOS or distributed DOS attacks, an attacker attempts to take the online server down or make it unavailable to the legitimate users. An internet server DOS or distributed DOS attacks often targets high-profile web servers like banks, credit card payment gateway, and even root name servers. To crash the web server running the appliances, attackers target the flowing services by consuming the online server with the fake request. And attacker mainly targets network bandwidth during DOS attacks. They also target server memory during DOS attacks. They target application exception handling mechanism during denial of service attacks. Hackers target CPU usage during denial of service attacks, and during denial of service attacks, they also target hard disk space and database spaces. Then there is another type of web server attacks that is called DNS server hijacking. So what is DNS? DNS is a domain name system. It resolves a domain name to its corresponding IP addresses. A user carries the DNS server with a domain name and it delivers the corresponding IP address. So in a DNS server hijacking, an attacker compromises the DNS server and changes the mapping settings of the target DNS server to redirect to a raw DNS server so that it might redirect the user request to the attacker's raw server. Thus, when the user types the legitimate URL in a browser, the setting will redirect to the attacker's fake sites. Then there is a DNS amplification attack. In that, recursive DNS query may be a method of requesting DNS mapping. The query goes through domain name server recursively until it fails to find the specified domain name to IP address mapping. Following are the steps involved in processing recursive DNS request. Step 1 is user who want to resolve the IP address for a selected domain send the DNS query to the primary DNS server specified in its TCP/IP properties. Steps 2 to 7. During steps 2 to 7, we try to check if the requested DNS mapping is not present on the user's primary DNS server, then it will forward the request to the root server. Then the root server will forward the request to .com namespace where the user could find DNS mappings. So this process repeats recursively until DNS mapping is resolved. Then there is a step 8. During step 8, when the system finds the memory DNS server for the requested DNS mapping, it generates a cache for the IP address within the user's primary DNS server. Attackers exploit recursive DNS query to perform a DNS amplification attacks that lead to distributed denial of service attacks on the victim's DNS server. So here we discuss the steps involved in processing recursive DNS request. So after processing recursive DNS request, following steps we have to take care for DNS amplification attacks. Step 1 is the attacker instruct compromised hosts or ports to form DNS queries within the network. Step 2, all the compromised hosts use a spoof victim IP address and send DNS query request to the victim's primary DNS server configured in its TCP IP settings. In steps 3 to 8, if the requested DNS mapping is not present on the victim primary DNS server, the server forward the request to the root server. Root server will forward the request to .com or respective TLD namespace. This process repeats recursively until the victim's primary DNS server resolves the DNS mapping request. And in step 9, after the first DNS server finds the DNS mapping for the victim request, it sends the DNS mapping response to the victim IP address. This response goes to the victim as bots are using the victim IP address, and the reply to an outside number of DNS mapping requests from the bots and in distributed denial of service attacks on the victim's DNS server. Then, man in the middle or a snipping attack is one of the most common web server attacks. In that attacks, attackers allow an attacker to access sensitive information by intercepting and altering communication between an end user and web server. So in this attacks, an intruder intercept or modify the message exchange between the users and web server through eavesdropping or intruding into a connection. This enables an attacker to steal sensitive user information like online banking details, usernames, passwords, and so on, transferred over the online to the web server. The attackers try to trap the victim to attach to the online server by pretending to be a proxy. If the victim believes and agrees to the attacker's request, then all the communication between the users and therefore the web server passes through the attackers. During this way, the attacker can steal sensitive user information. Another type of web server attack is directory traversal attacks. In that, an attacker could also be ready to perform a directory traversal attack thanks to a vulnerability present within the code of the online application. Additionally, to the present poorly patched or configured web server software can make the online server itself vulnerable to a directory traversal attacks. The design of web server limits public access to some extent. Directory traversal is the exploitation of HTTP through which attackers can access restricted directories and execute commands outside of the online server's root directory by manipulating a URL. In the directly traversal attack, attackers use // sequence to access restricted directory outside of the online server's root directory. Attackers can use the trial and error method to navigate outside of the basis directory and access sensitive information within the system. An attacker exploits the software that may be web server program on the online server to perform directly traversal attacks. The attackers usually perform these attacks with the assistance of a browser. An internet server is vulnerable to this attack if it accepts input file from a browser without proper validation. So now we cover different type of web server attacks. Next topic of today's lecture is misconfiguration of web server. Web server misconfiguration refers to the configuration weakness in web infrastructure that can be exploited to launch various attacks on web server like directly traversal, server intrusion, and data theft. Following are some of the online server misconfiguration, that is verbose, debug, or error messages, anonymous or default users or passwords, sample configuration and a script file, remote administration functions, unnecessary service enabled, misconfigured, or /default SSL certificates. Administrator who configure web server improperly may leave serious loopholes within the web server, thereby giving an attacker the prospects to exploit the misconfigured web server to compromise its security and acquire sensitive information. The vulnerability of improperly configured web server could also be related to configuration, application, files, scripts, or sites. An attacker looks for such vulnerable web server to launch attacks. The misconfiguration of an internet server gives the attacker a path to enter the target network of a corporation. These loopholes within the server also can help an attacker to bypass user authentication. Once detected, these problems are often easily exploited and end in the entire compromise of an internet site hosted on the target web server. Then the next topic of today's lecture is HTTP response splitting attack. In that attack, this attack may be a web-based attack during which the attacker tricks the server by injecting new lines into response header alongside arbitrary code. It involves adding header response data into the input field in order that the server split the responses into responses. This sort of attack exploits vulnerability in input validation. Cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgery and SQL injection are number of samples of this sort of attacks. During these attacks, the attacker controls the input parameter and cleverly constructs an invitation header that causes two responses from the server. The attacker alters one request to size two requests by adding header response data into the input field. The online server in turn responds to every request. The attacker can pass malicious data to a vulnerable application and therefore the application includes the info in HTTP response header. The attacker can control the primary response to redirect the users to a malicious website, whereas the online browser will discard other responses. In this example, the attacker sends a response splitting request to the server split the response into two and sent the primary response to the attacker and second response to the victim. After receiving the response from web server, the victim requests services by providing credentials. At the same time, the attacker requests the index page, then the online server sends the response to the victim request to the attacker and therefore the victim remains uninformed. Then there is a webcast poisoning attack. Webcast poisoning attacks the reliability of an intermediate webcast sources. In this attack, the attacker swaps cache content for a random URL with infected content. Users of the online cache source can unknowingly use the poisoned content instead of true and secure content when requesting the required URL through the online cache. An attacker forces the online server's cache to flush its actual cache content and send a specially crafted request to store in cache. During this case, all the users of that web server cache will get malicious content until the server flushes the online cache. Web cache poisoning attacks are possible if the online server and application has HTTP response splitting floats. So now we see the snapshot of webcast poisoning and hijacking HTTP response using burp set. In the burp, we go to proxy to intercept tab and make sure intercept is switch off. Then we launch the embedded browser and use it to the access the flowing URL. When the page loads, click Access the Lab to the launch your own instance of a fake shopping website. This may take a few seconds to load. And these are the websites. Here we click on the Access the Lab and we use this credential, user ID and winner is user ID, Peter is password, and then we log in. After that, we have to make an account on a Portswigger. I make an account with this email and I got this random password. Then I log in to a Portswigger and they give me a store credit of $100 as a welcome. Now I hear update email and now shopping starts. Here they are showing so many items. One is a leather jacket that cost $1,337. There is a portable hat that cost $4.51. There is a real life photoshopping that that cost $45.94 and there is a comp page that cost $57.61. We are selecting one jackets and we are clicking on add to cart. Then it so I have a store credit 100 and I have a selected two items. Then we go to proxy, then we go to HTTP history under proxy tab. To make this easier to read, we keep clicking the headers of the leftmost column until the requests are sorted in descending order. This way can see the most recent request at the top. Step 3 is identify an interesting request. So here we notice that each time we access a product page, the browser sends a get/product request with a product ID query parameter to see. Here it's a product ID equal 3 and when we capturing that HTTP request and response, it is also showing get product ID equal 3. Then we send the request to the burp repeater. We right click on any of the get product ID equal request and select send to repeater. Then request and response both opens and under repeater we try to make changes into request. We make it to 1 and then we are sending the response and when we send the request in the browsers, now our product selected product change, it is showing we have selected real life photoshopping but actually we have selected jacket, but we are now going to buy this product. So this way we can poison the parameters with parameter. So the last topic of today's lecture is SSH brute force attacks on web server. In that, attacker used the SSH protocol to make an encrypted SSH tunnel between two hosts as to transfer encrypted data over an insecure network. Usually SSH runs on TCP port 22 so as to conduct an attack on SSH. The attackers scan the whole 55H server using bots, perform TCP port 22 port scan to spot possible vulnerabilities. With the help of brute force attacks, the attackers gains the login credential to unauthorized access to an SSH tunnels. And attacker who gain the login credential of SSH, can use an equivalent SSH tunnel to transmit malware and other means of exploitation to victims without being detected. Attackers use tools like Nmap and Crack on a Linux platform to perform an SSH brute force attack. So, any questions in today's lectures, feel free to ask. Assignment 1 is missing only one submitted for missing, and only 5 students are here. Lim has not joined Google Classroom, so please inform Lim. Lim is in today class or not? No, Lim is not in today class.
Which first assignment? The literature review?
Yes. No, we may.
Okay.
You may take
You said
time.
26.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Then the second one will let me check if, but if here no one submitted till now. Everyone is making. And again, Lim has not joined Google Classroom. And now we are in Unit 3. So third assignment will also plot. We have to create some web server with just a one web page and not a complex web server, just a single homepage website. Host on your web server and try to attack on it.
So could you repeat host a web server and then what?
You can make a web server using either LAMP, using that means you can install Apache on your Kali Linux or it is already installed, you may check,
Okay.
and then you can just make a one page website, just
Okay.
name.jack.html, kubra.html. In that
Uh-huh.
you just put your information, just your biography, just write about you, put your photo, so one web page completed. So host that web page to the Apache. Then you can go to browser, type localhost colon and the port number of Apache 80. Then your website will open. Okay. So web server configured inside your PC. Then you may check what type of possibility of attacks are possible on your small website. Or if you can make it complex, you can make a login page, then you can do SQL injection, so many attacks then possible. But a static, we can gather information, we can list the vulnerability, we can use the HTTP enum which we have taught in unit 1 itself. So we can run the script using nmap HTTP enum, they will hide the vulnerability inside. So I will type that assignment 3 and put also here. So just the simple way in way we may say, or if you add create here an assignment, the instruction will Simple. We install and configure Apache Web Server. Steps 1. Okay, so break by steps. So if some student may say, sir, I don't know about web designing, so no problem. Just download any HTML page from anywhere and post your own page website on it. And then try to make possible attacks, run a script, and gather information about your web server. So this assignment will have 3 parts. This and then copy class invite link. Only to Jack and Syed. Today's lecture number 16. Jack, Syed. Okay, so we mark all attendance. So in afternoon, we again meet for the lab session. We'll discuss some lab experiment from your syllabus.
Okay, sir.